About 2 years from now, it's safe to say we'll be decompressing from another epic first-in-the-nation primary. That may seem like a long way off, but that season will be upon us in the blink of an eye. The first Democratic candidate to throw his hat in the ring joins us today on Close Up. Congressman John Delaney of Maryland, thanks for being here.
It's great to be with you.
Appreciate it. So take us through. You declared this candidacy in July of 2017.
Yes.
Why start running for president when the new president has only been in office for a few months?
So I think the American people are actually ready to turn the page on the current president, right? So I think you almost can't get in too early in this race. And I really do believe the country needs an important conversation about our future, because we're not doing the kind of things we need to do to prepare our country for the future. And my party, the Democratic Party, we've had a rough couple of years from an elections perspective. We've lost the White House, the House of Representatives, the Senate, 2/3 of the governors, and 1,000 state legislative seats across the last several years. And I think we need an important conversation about what is our future. So I think I'm the right person for the job. I think I have the right vision, but not enough people know who I am. And the way to solve that problem is to get in early and come here to New Hampshire and do what I did this morning, which is to get together with voters and introduce myself, tell them about my background as a kind of blue-collar kid who was a successful entrepreneur and then decided to do public service, ran for Congress, and I've been in Congress for the last 6 years. So introduce myself to them, but importantly, hear what they have to say. Right, hear what they have to say.
So some people might expect an early running Democrat to be sort of a hyper-partisan, hard-left individual. That doesn't really describe you at all. Why should Democrats get excited about a more middle-of-the-road moderate candidate?
So the way I look at this, the central question facing this country right now is how do we bring this terribly fractured nation back together? The divisions in our country are destroying us. They're tearing communities apart. They're preventing us from doing the things we need to do to prepare our country for the future. And so I think what the Democratic Party should become is the party that actually wants to restore civility, respect, and competence to public service. That's the kind of strategy that can create a winning coalition so that not only we do the right thing as a governing party, but we actually can become the Big Ten party that allows us to win these elections. And that's what I'm focused on in this campaign. I've got a whole bunch of policy ideas, mostly focused on the future. I think the past, which tends to dominate the political debate, is interesting, but it's not particularly relevant for what's happening to our children. What are we doing to prepare our country for a world that's changing so rapidly? This is a conversation we ought to be able to agree with each other on and come together and get things done for the American people.
So you want to build that winning coalition, but if you're the nominee going against Donald Trump in 2020, how do you beat this politician who has sort of done an end around on so much of our political norms and our process and won when people thought he would lose?
So listen, I think Donald Trump is unfit to be the president of the United States. I think he's doing things right now that are actually betraying the American people. He is affirmatively not ordering our intelligence and our law enforcement communities to do anything about Russia interfering in our 2018 elections. Just one example of why he's not fit to be the president. But I don't think the Democratic Party can just run campaigns saying how bad the president is. I think the American people will draw their own conclusion about the president. I think what we have to do is tell the American people what we're going to do for them, how we're going to do things to improve their job, their pay, and create more opportunities for their children. That's what most Americans care about. They also care about us kind of governing in a way where we're actually representing the will of the American people. There's so many issues today. You talked about kind of school safety in your opening comments. There's so many issues today that there's broad agreement among the American people as to what we should do, but we're not getting it done in Congress because Congress is so divided, and hyper-partisan politics and special interests have really prevented our government from doing anything.
You mentioned the hyper-partisanship there in Congress. If you're elected, you'd be the first congressman in the White House in about 30 years.
Yeah.
How would you get an agenda through a Congress that is essentially fractured and can't pass anything big, either Republican or Democrat, since Obamacare?
So the democracy still works if people vote and make their opinions heard. And I'm running for president with the notion of bringing the country together. And I'm making certain commitments to the American people. The first thing I'm saying is, God is my witness, I will never say things to divide our country. I won't act as if half the country's entirely wrong about what they believe. In my first 100 days in office, I will only do bipartisan kind of initiatives. Wouldn't that be amazing if a president in their inauguration said, I represent every American and I'm going to prove it to you. In my first 100 days, my agenda is going to be full of things where there's broad agreement and I'm going to get them done. Right? That's the kind of president I want to be. I want to debate the Congress. once a quarter, the President of the United States should go to the floor of the House of Representatives and actually debate the Congress on the issues of the day, so the American people can start seeing the truth, something that's become elusive in our politics. So you have to change the whole kind of attitude around our government. We have to restore trust and some faith in the American people in our government. And that'll create the dynamic where the representatives will actually come to Washington to do the people's business as opposed to the business of the special interest. So you have to kind of change everything. You have to appeal to the better side of our people. The president right now appeals to the worst side in our citizens. And I think that's what we need to change.
Here's a question I think everyone running for president needs to answer at a kind of gut check level if they're going to be the commander-in-chief in 2020. Are you prepared to fight a war on the Korean Peninsula that could claim tens of thousands of American lives?
Well, I think that would be a terrible, terrible outcome. And I think we have to pursue diplomatic solutions, right, at almost all costs to prevent that from actually happening. I think one of the things the president has done that has hurt our ability to do that, aside from his rhetoric, is he's basically caused us to retreat from so many of the alliances that have been built since really World War II that have made this country safer and more prosperous. And a good example is what he did with something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right, which is the large trade agreement that President Obama and the Congress were working on for years, which would have made the United States kind of the lead nation in an 11-nation bloc alliance in Asia that would control 40% of the Asian economy. It's much easier to put pressure on China to deal with North Korea if you're actually kind of exerting economic influence in the region. But when the president tears up that agreement and effectively withdraws the United States from having a seat at the table in the Asian economy, which is the fastest growing economy in the world, we basically turn over the Asian economy to China. So it hurts our ability to put pressure on them. And my point there is diplomatic and economic relations are kind of tied together. And I think the president doesn't understand that. So what you described, the scenario in North Korea, right, is a horrible, horrible outcome. North Korea has been kind of labeled the land of bad options, right, because we don't have a lot of options. What we have to pursue is tremendous pressure on China because they still support the regime. We have to continue to put diplomatic pressure. I support the sanctions that the president and his administration has put in place with the UN. And then I think we have to do things to try to get to the people of North Korea so that they understand there's a better option. I think what happened around the Olympics, while it's small, I think was a positive step. I think the discussions between South Korea and North Korea have been constructive thus far. We should be supportive of those things, but we have to continue to put tremendous economic and political pressure on that regime to get them to the table so that we could have a way forward where they're kind of denuclearized and we have stability in the region.
On international trade, the president wants to bring back protectionism, put some tariffs on steel and aluminum. You were in business. Will this help the American economy or hurt it?
Look, we should be enforcing trade agreements. That would help the American economy. We should be tough on countries that are manipulating currencies. That'll help the American economy. But coming out with kind of his not well thought out kind of proposals. You know, I heard the other day that a car manufactured by Ford in Detroit crosses the Canadian border 7 times before it's finally produced. In other words, they make some things in Detroit, they send the car to Canada, a supplier does other things, they send it back. Are you going to tax that car 20% every time it crosses the border? Of course not. So I think the president hasn't really thought through the implications of this, which is not a surprise because he doesn't really think about policy. And he also fundamentally doesn't understand that so many of the economic relationships we've put in place around the world have been extraordinarily helpful to the American people. Again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be tougher in these trade agreements. We should get the best deal we possibly can for the American people. That doesn't mean we shouldn't support, efforts to kind of crack down on countries that are manipulating their currency or engaging in unfair practices. But it's got to be done in the context of what the world is. The world is tremendously interconnected, right, economically. The world's become smaller in many ways. That's actually good for the United States of America. But what it also means is what happens around the world is more important to us than it's ever been. And we need to sit at these tables. And starting trade wars, right, is a terrible way to create kind of the economic and political stability we need around the world.
So you were a CEO, you were in the financial services industry.
Yes.
You may not have worked on Wall Street.
Never did.
That sort of comes into the conversation right now. And can a person with that background, as good as it might be to be a chief executive, is that hurt you in the Democratic primary here in 2020?
No, I think I have the exact kind of background that people should look for in a president. I grew up in a blue-collar family. My dad was an electrician. Neither of my parents went to college. I got a great education. I was a successful entrepreneur. I started 2 businesses. I was the youngest CEO in the New York Stock Exchange when I took my first company public in the mid-90s. And then I rolled up my sleeves and I decided to do public service. And I went into the House of Representatives and I've served there for 6 years. So blue-collar kid, successful entrepreneur, business builder, created thousands of jobs, and now I serve in the House of Representatives. That's the kind of profile I think people are looking for, because I've had a lot of different life experiences. And I've had a track record of being successful at the different things I've done. But in terms of my business background, the businesses that I set up were designed to finance small to mid-sized businesses. And we established the companies, and they were successful precisely because Wall Street was ignoring these businesses. So to some extent, my businesses were responding to the fact that Wall Street had strayed and gotten to the speculative kind of businesses that basically brought down the U.S. economy. And I was building kind of an old-fashioned business, lending money to small to mid-sized businesses, the exact type of businesses that create all the jobs in this country. We finance 5,000 small to mid-sized businesses across the country, and I'm incredibly proud of the track record of the company. And it's still doing that. I'm no longer involved in it, but it's still doing that today.
Congressman John Delaney, we thank you for your time today. And
so nice to be with you.
I'm sure we'll see you back here soon.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. All right, coming up, a look at what's being done in New Hampshire to keep children safe at school in the wake of the mass shooting in Florida, and State Senator Dan Feltes on whether he's running for governor.